Thanks, Glenn. Welcome to Lunch with the League. I am Julie Rodewald, the Voter Services Director for the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County. As most of you know, the League is a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to protect the right to vote and educate the public on topics of importance. Today, our special guest is Tommy Gong, the San Luis Obispo County Clerk Recorder. Tommy recently announced that he will be leaving San Luis Obispo County for a position with the Contra Costa Clerk Recorder, where he will oversee the elections for over 700,000 registered voters in that county. The League thanks Tommy for his many years of service to the voters of San Luis Obispo County and always being willing to participate in our education efforts. He and his staff had done an exemplary job securing and processing our votes, particularly during the demanding 2020 elections. And we are thankful that he has agreed to talk with us today about the future of elections in our county. Tommy has a PowerPoint presentation, and then we will open the floor to questions which can be posted by you in the Q&A feature. Tommy, the platform is yours.
Great, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share with you, what we're looking forward to for elections going forward, and a little bit about what we've done recently. I'm going to share my PowerPoint here, and you should be able to see that. Okay, so. I wanted to start off first by reflecting a little bit on our most recent election. And it was really one for the ages, as I like to say. It was really an election that we've never had before because of, in particular, the COVID-19 pandemic that was taking place. And as we knew that this was going to be just about, the largest election that we're ever going to see, or that we've ever seen. So what happened basically as a result of Governor Newsom's executive orders and the subsequent state legislation that followed was that every registered voter would be sent a ballot in the mail. That was the first thing that the state decided would be the best thing to do to combat the pandemic, especially in light of what was happening at other states' primary elections as we were sitting on the sidelines. So our election was pretty early, being March 3rd, and being able to see what other states was going through with their long lines of voters, cancellation of poll workers and polling places, and not really having the infrastructure to support all of the vote by mail requests in other states. Because California had such a large number of permanent vote by mail voters, it was an easy stretch for California to be able to send a ballot to every voter, for example. But then we had to convert our election day polling place, 1 day of voting, to a 4-day voter service center operation. Either you were going to do a polling place operation or a voter service center operation. And in our case, because we weren't sure we were going to be able to have the same number of polling places that we would have had in the primary election, we opted to go with the voter service center, which was probably provided the best level of service to all the voters who showed up in person. But that required us to revamp all of our election worker hiring and our training. We had to have workers who would be paid hourly, who were willing to work for multiple days, serving voters, and their training that goes along with it, of which I actually have to pay homage to Julie for being the person to take this on because of all of the changes. I was calling every favor to help us get through this election. We also had to distribute and obtain all of the PPE equipment that would be located, that would be utilized both by poll workers and voters as well, and implement an extensive voter outreach and education program to let voters know what to expect during this election. And we were encouraging them to vote by mail because we thought that was the safest means of voting for them. And so what resulted was that we had a huge election that we accomplished. And this shows a little bit of statistics that we maintain. And this shows each of the presidential elections going back to 2000. and we see a steady increase of registered voters. And voter turnout is always high during a presidential election, but we really leapfrogged at 88.35% in terms of our turnout. And I was trying to find a metric that would show how effective that was for San Luis Obispo County, um, because throughout the state, uh, you know, every county had a record-shattering number of registered voters and voter turnout. But what I started to look at was how did we fare in compared to the other 57 counties in terms of the turnout? And that's where I saw that we leapfrogged from 12th place to the previous two presidential elections to 4th place. And so we really showed a marked improvement compared to our other counterparts in California. And I was trying to figure out why. Why might this have been the case? Because obviously it was a high turnout, across the state. And I like to think that it had a lot to do with the increased amount of voter education and outreach that we had performed. And we'll talk about that a little more later too. But also a record-shattering number of those who did vote by mail, and I think it did have something to do with the pandemic, that we ended up with 94% of our voters who did vote, they voted by mail instead of in person. And I think they did take that into consideration to how can they exercise their options as safely as possible. And that we also had a significant reduction in provisional ballots because of the nature of the vote center operation. And we certainly had an increase in what is known as conditional voter registration, also known as same-day registration, which is something that recently became available to voters starting in 2016. This shows a little bit of turnout about where we were by age group. And this shows that we really had a strong showing across the board between all of the various age groups. But certainly between the 55 and up, we really had more than 90% turnout, which is uh, quite substantial. But also then next slide is illustrating the trend. And what I tried to do there is to compare. Now we had a change in voter registration system. So some of the statistics were being tracked differently from the previous system that we had. The previous system we had between in decades, 18 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, whereas the system that we're using now is represented in the second row, 18 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44. And what that allowed me to do, I was thinking, boy, am I going to really be comparing like numbers here? But what's amazing is this is a 4-year turnaround time. So if you think about it, the 18 to 20-year-olds would be in this age group of the 18 to 24, and the 20 to 30 age group would be in the 25 to 34 age group. So really, I'm looking at age groups in this case, with 4 years difference between 2016 and 2020. So I was very fortunate that I was able to extract this. And what it showed is the increase of participation within that same age group. And so what we really saw is between this 25 to 44 age group was a large increase of participation, 47% increase, 35% increase, are quite staggering when you think about that. That increase over the 4-year period of time. So that was something that's illustrated in the gray bar to show the market increase. So certainly with this 47.2% and 35.4% really shows that increase of that age group. So the younger voters really did come out in force to participate in the presidential election, and hats off to them for participating. Next slide also illustrates over the past 20 years, the increase in vote by mail participation. This shows the numbers of the blue bar illustrates the number of in-person voting, and the darker blue line illustrates the number of vote by mail. So certainly we had a huge increase, and I'm sure there are multiple factors that lead to this huge increase. And I guess the question will be is this going to be the trend forevermore? It's hard to tell. Certainly, the pandemic, I think, did have an influence on voters deciding to vote by mail, and that trend may change ever so much. It's everyone's bet and everyone's guess to determine where that's going to be next year, for example, and where that will be in the next presidential cycle, given that we won't have a pandemic to operate under. But we certainly have seen this increase forevermore, and I think it will continue to increase. But it certainly worked out for San Luis Obispo County in the model that we adopted. We were able to support, sending everyone a vote by mail ballot, being able to handle the increase. And typically, we would have not more than 100,000 vote by mail ballots, as we illustrated in 2016. And so we, had another 50,000 ballots basically to process, vote by mail ballots to process in our office. And I just guess I would say I was fortunate. I was seeing this trend happening, and I was like trying to figure out, where am I going to store all of these ballots? Because we only have so much space in our elections office, and so I started to cry wolf a little bit that the sky's falling, because I need to have some more space to accommodate these ballots. And just luckily, we were able to get those additional storage space in time, because we ended up using that additional storage area, especially in light of this increase. I wasn't anticipating to have this much. I think I said to myself, okay, well, we need to figure for 160,000 ballots. I'll never have that to worry about. Here it was, I was filling up all of those cabinets as a result. This next slide does show also, though, the increase by age group of those who participated vote by mail. So it shows the participation rate, and practically everyone voted in high numbers in vote by mail. The very youngest age group might have been the students, for example, at Cal Poly. I didn't have a chance to really break that down. But on second thought, Julie, actually, we had a pretty low turnout at Cal Poly, come to think of it. So, but maybe the first-time voters wanted to have the opportunity to see what a polling place, see what a vote center looked like, especially during those 4 days of voting. So that's kind of interesting. But nonetheless, that would have been about 12% of that voting base. But in particular is the number of provisional and conditional voter registrations that were done by age group. And I think what this is illustrating to us, especially when I'm looking at the 18 to 24 and the 25 to 34 age group, is that they could have been recently moved to the county, for example, like they could have been moved in at Cal Poly. And last minute, they decided that, they wanted to register here. And but it does show, I think, a propensity possibly, and this is the first time that I've been able to track this, of a younger age group might have the greater need of voting same day registration for one reason or another. They might be moving to college and needing that ability to be able to register as late as election day to be able to participate in the election. So there's some pretty interesting statistics that we've seen happen. So now what I want to do is just kind of what to expect for San Luis Obispo going forward now. So on May 4th, the Board of Supervisors, my intention on May 4th was actually to report to our board, first of all, about voting systems and what takes place in all of the processes and procedures that take place with voting systems, to educate them and to educate the public. But then the second part was really to explain the difference between a one-day polling place operation to a multiple day vote center operation and the benefits and costs involved with it. Certainly it was going to cost more to do a vote center operation, but really my aim at that meeting was to get more information, to see if there were any questions of the board, because I had actually created what is known as a budget augmentation request. Because the vote center operation certainly was going to cost more with the multiple days of operation, that I needed to make a request for a budget increase to be able to continue that type of operation. And so I had already created the request, and knowing that this was going to be presented to the board during budget hearings, which would be next week, I believe, then I wanted to get more information so that I could make a recommendation which way we were going to move forward. And what I really was planning to do at that time was to say, what's best for the voters? We know what type of work is involved in a vote center versus a polling place, but at the end of the day, what would have been the best thing for voters? But the Board of Supervisors decided to go ahead and go forward and move forward on the election model that they desired. And so what resulted was going back to polling places. Now, I'm going to say that I don't think it was a bad decision. I was actually, struggling with the decision. That's why I wanted to answer any questions or have any direction that was provided. But certainly in San Luis Obispo, I think one thing that I recognize is that we are very geographically dispersed, as large a county as we are. One of the things that I learned is that, because we had 23 voting locations versus our typical 75 polling places. And so, for instance, we did not have a voting location in the communities of Cayucas, San Miguel, Shandon, Creston, and Santa Margarita. And the voters that lived in those areas recognized that. They asked me questions about it. And so I said, this is, due to the pandemic, it's something certainly I would look into. Should we continue this model? And so, those were things that I recognized that because of the nature, one size does not fit all for every county in that, when it comes to a voting model. So in this way, I did, with the supervisors deciding to go with the polling places, I did not think it was a bad idea just the same. So we're going to be back to 75 polling place locations for one day of voting. It would be our, election day. In this way, as typical, we would assign voters their polling place. So if we're sending a sample ballot booklet, they're going to be informed as to where their polling place is, and that's to be the location that they should be going to on election day. Back to recruiting 1,000 poll workers, as opposed to, I think we had about 350 vote center workers. We would have pre-printed ballots instead of the ballot on demand system that we had at our 23 locations. And we would have a paper roster that voters would sign into. I think we would still have our PPE equipment that we would have available to voters in some way, shape, or form. Especially with with gel, hand gel, and having encouraging voters to bring their own personal pen, for example, I think is always a good practice going forward now. And that in the March election, primary election last year, it was a polling place election. So we had experience with both polling places and the vote center operation last year. And what we did in the March election is that we utilized a call center. Now we noticed that almost entirely the number of provisional voters that we have are because they were sent a vote by mail ballot. We're at like 82, 83% permanent vote by mail voters. So most of the time, the voters that are going to go to a polling place have already been issued a vote by mail ballot. And so therefore, and if they don't have that ballot to surrender, then they're required to vote a provisional ballot. But with the use of a call center, what we did last year, March, is that we had the poll worker call us, and then we could determine that their vote by mail ballot was not returned to the office, in which we would void that ballot, and then they could vote in person, a regular ballot at the polling place. And that greatly reduced the number of provisional ballots that we had to process during the canvass. And also, just better off for the voter. I know voters always feel better when they're voting a regular ballot that they put in the ballot box versus having to vote a provisional ballot that goes into the envelope to be adjudicated during the canvass process. So as I mentioned, permanent vote by mail voters and mail ballot precinct voters will continue to be sent a vote by mail ballot 29 days before the election. It's about 81 to 83% of all of our registered voters. Polling place voters can still request a vote by mail ballot during the month preceding the election, and we can certainly get them a ballot sent to them. Our election offices will be open 29 days before the election to be issued a vote by mail ballot upon the voter's request. That would be both our office in San Luis Obispo, and we would plan to have our Atascadero office open for that very purpose, and in particular for the vote by mail processing, issuing. We would continue to utilize the vote by mail ballot drop boxes. That was a huge success during the November election. We had more ballots turned in with the drop box than we did in any other method. So it was hugely popular. I think that voters liked the idea that the ballots were being delivered directly to the elections office instead of through the postal service, for example. So voters really enjoyed doing that, and also help save taxpayers money, because if they did send it through the post office, then it was a prepaid envelope that we would be that the county would pay for that return postage. So for voters to drop them off in the drop box, that helped save us about 91 cents per ballot. So it becomes more expensive when it's being delivered to us in that manner. And that we would highly recommend to the board that we would continue the extensive voter outreach and education program that we've believe that this is really a proven concept that we want to move forward on, and to continue, because if there are any changes, which then now it would be back to only 83% of our voters receiving vote by mails, we need to let the remaining polling place voters know that they're going to get a sample ballot in the mail instead of a vote by mail ballot, for example, so that they would understand that. So here are some of the differences between the polling place versus what we call the Voters' Choice Act or the vote center operation. So just to reiterate, with the polling place operation, only the permanent vote by mail voters and the mail ballot precinct voters will receive the ballot in the mail. All other voters must request a vote by mail ballot, which they will have their request postcard in their sample ballot booklets. Replacement vote by mail ballots would only be available at the election offices instead of at the vote centers, voter service centers that we had in the past. That's typically what we've done in the past. That we would have, yes, so we would send the sample ballot booklets to the non-vote by mail voters, and voter information guides would be in the vote by mail packets for the permanent and mail ballot precinct voters. 1 day of voting, 75 to 76 voting locations, 1,000 poll workers, assigned polling places, a static paper roster. Voters would need to go to their assigned polling place, or quite possibly have to vote provisionally, most likely would have to vote provisionally. We would expect more provisional ballots with a polling place operation as it goes. However, though, we would continue to aim to utilize the call center to mitigate the provisional ballot situation. We would have pre-printed ballots instead of the ballot on demand printing. Provisional ballots could be held with the ICX ballot marking machine, since all of the precinct ballots would be available on the ballot marking machine that we have at each polling place, primarily designed for voters with disabilities, but they could be utilized in other ways too. And that unvoted ballots from the polling place would be one-time use only. So whatever we have left over, could not be used again. And that was the one thing we recognized with the ballot on demand system, is that we have a lot of unused paper stock that could be used for future elections, and which we would use in our offices where we would be having the ballot on demand printer, so that we could continue to utilize it in that fashion. And then next, I wanted to kind of give you the final results of our voter survey that we conducted in early March through early April through late May. We had 6,500 people participate in this survey. We wanted to get a gauge and hear it from the voters, what voters thought about their experience during the election. And so just some highlights out of this was that overwhelmingly, those who participated really did find the benefit of voting by mail instead of in person. There were many different reasons why they found it to be highly convenient for them, so that they could, vote at home at their leisure, be able to study the issues, feel comfortable with their decisions, and be able to send that ballot sending that ballot in time. So there's a lot less stress in being able to do so, but the convenience of being able to have it at home with them and being able to send it or put it into a Dropbox was hugely beneficial. Um, this one here asked them, if you were to vote in person, would you prefer having the polling place model, 1 day of voting, or the 4 days of voting with the voter service center? And it certainly showed a slight increase for those who like the idea of more opportunities for a voter to be able to go on multiple days. But this is by far, in terms of the results of the questions, this is the closest result, meaning that, between 56 and 43%, you could almost say that this was, we were almost split in terms of what voters preferred one way or the other. And so again, that's why it was not a showstopper, I would say, that we would go back to a polling place operation. This here shows we did have two questions, and we wanted to gauge it on voters about how they felt about the election and how confident they were that their ballots were being counted accurately. And this is a very high confidence score of 8.78. However, though, I will tell you that the number of respondents, let me give you the breakdown of that. We had 37, almost 3,800 of the respondents were identified themselves with the Democratic Party, and their average score was 9.8. The Republican Party responses were much lower. There were about 850 respondents only from those identified with the Republican Party, and their average score was 5. So only about half of the score here. And then no party preference voters, there were about 1,100 respondents, and their average score was 8.59. So that's where we ended up with an 8.78% score. But certainly there were more Democratic voters who responded to this survey. And the next was, how confident were you in the overall integrity of the county elections office? And this very closely followed the same scores as previously. So out of about 3,800 respondents, Democratic Party 9.77, Republican Party 850 respondents 5.29, and no party preference about 1,100 respondents 8.57. So, but nonetheless, I was very proud that we got high scores here by the voters who chose to participate in the survey. And then we asked them what were ways that they thought we could do, what could we do to increase voter confidence? That was one of the objectives of the survey. And we gave them a number of ideas of what they could, ideas that we had that they could say this is, things that they thought would be worthwhile for us to do. So one of them was, the biggest one was more transparent processes. And that is that what we understand, and I get this too, the elections is not always as straightforward as people perceive. They just think, well, first of all, people only think we work 1 day a year, right? On election day. And of course, that is not the case here. It becomes like a 6-month process of which it gets very busy for about 90 days. And so to inform and to educate the voters of what we do, and for them to have a better understanding. It could be for them to come in and observe, for example, but I see it as other ways that, behind the scenes videos, these are all things that we could do more so that the public would have more education, a better understanding of what takes place during the course of an election, I think could be had across the board, would be very beneficial for the public to understand. Secondly, more education and outreach. These all kind of go hand in hand. So, certainly I had many speaking engagements. I think we were at last count 40 different speaking engagements to local clubs and community organizations to explain the differences, to answer any questions of the public. And so that was, again, I think that helped with our outcome of the high number of those turning out to vote. Um, and that we did have, constant media ads, either on radio stations or through digital ads, and continually reminding voters, hey, these deadlines are coming up. Make sure you're registered to vote, or make sure now that you have your ballot in your hands to vote that ballot. And so I do think that this voter education and outreach program that we instituted, and this is the first time that we really made it more of a formal approach, that I would consider this a big success for the county in this way. And then lastly was, again, these behind the scenes videos, again, to provide more transparency. Some of the most successful things that we did was, explaining to the voters, where's my ballot? Explaining to them how they can track their ballot, number one, with the ballots be sent to all voters. And then our most popular was a day in the life of your ballot. What happens to your vote by mail ballot once we receive it? And so we went through all of the processes that is involved in checking the signature and making sure that it matches, to opening them, to preparing them for counting, putting them through our tabulators, and even the adjudication process, I believe we covered briefly, so that voters would understand what takes place. And these are all things that I think becomes really should become a regular thing for us, to continually educate the voters so that they have a better understanding and more confidence in our election process, and therefore, no real questions as to what takes place. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing these, but certainly I made this available to the local league, and so they can share that out if they like to. So that's the end of my presentation, but I'm certainly open to questions then.
We do have some questions, Tommy. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the kind of the plans for going forward to increase confidence in the elections. So I have a couple of questions, and then we have about 9 questions that have come in our Q&A. There's several of them that are about your decision for leaving and what's going to happen to the office, and we'll get to those. But I want to talk first about the subject about the future of elections in our county. So one of the questions is, given the return to the polling place model of elections, what can voters do to make sure that they can participate in every election?
Yeah, this is a good question, and certainly one is to be sure they're registered to vote, and that their registration information is up to date. So, for example, if they've moved within the county, for instance, they will want to be sure to re-register and provide that updated information to the county. And then also, I would say that if they want to vote by mail, then go ahead and to check that box or make their request to our office to become a permanent vote by mail voter. So even though that we're going back to polling places and not every voter will automatically be sent a vote by mail ballot, that the participation is still available, the offer is still available to become a permanent vote by mail voter, and so that ballot will be sent to voters for all future elections. I should also mention, so we're expecting a recall election to be conducted at the end of the year, and one thing that voters have to understand is that, okay, we have to follow the laws of the land. And one of the more recent, it happened right after the beginning of the year with urgency, was that the requirement to send every voter a ballot in the mail for elections in 2021 was passed with urgency. So because there were elections that were taking place earlier in the spring, in other counties, like vacancy elections. And so they needed to know, how were we going to conduct our election, in the same manner or in a different manner? And so that was passed. And so because of that, during the recall election, all voters will automatically be sent a ballot in the mail. And so these are things that, again, back to the voter education and outreach, so that, in these, whenever that election should occur during the fall, they're going to get a ballot in the mail. Given the June election during the primary next year, not everyone's going to get a ballot in the mail. So those will be things that will need to, voters will need to be educated, so they're not be confused with those changes.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard from year to year if the rules change for people to keep up to date. And the league will continue to do whatever we can to help educate voters there. I know that the board approved a few things in that meeting. The more secure or larger drop boxes, and the addition of mobile voting centers. And one of the questions that I had was, what were those and what's the benefit? And we had a question that came in about, what is the status of the mobile vote vehicle plans?
Okay, thank you. Those are great questions. As I was putting together the idea of doing vote centers, again, back to those 5 communities that weren't going to have a voting location for those 4 days of voting. And so the idea that came to mind was what Santa Cruz County had done. So I can't take credit for this. This is all credit given to Gail Pellerin in Santa Cruz County, where she had obtained what they affectionately call the vote mobile. And that was, she ordered basically a food truck trailer, and ripped out the grills and the refrigeration and all that, and instead put in the shelving to be able to accommodate the voting equipment that we would have had at a vote center. So we went up to Santa Cruz to take a look at it, and we fell in love with it, and got the information from them, who they ordered it from and all. And so that was something certainly we were looking at, to be able to provide like a day of voting. San Miguel, this is going to be on Saturday, we're going to be in San Miguel. On Sunday, we're going to be in Shandon, and things like this. Now, the need for that has somewhat subsided, but it is something we're still looking at, but it's not immediate on our needs right now. More so is the large scale permanently installed vote by mail ballot drop boxes, where they can hold 2,000 to 3,000 ballots at a time. We're working with our local libraries right now to be able to situate them mainly at the county libraries, to be able to permanently install them, have outdoor cameras in terms of surveillance, to be able to have eyes on them 24/7. And so we're working that through, and we'd like to have that ready to go for the recall election. And lastly, is a more substantial replacement vote by mail processing system. So on our trip to Santa Cruz, we also stopped by Monterey County to visit them and see their new elections office. And we saw their vote by mail equipment, and we were due to replace our vote by mail, our ballot openers, our letter openers. And so that's what got us thinking. And so we saw what they had, and it's at least 2 generations ahead of the operation that we have right now. And so that's something, because of the grant monies we have, we would be able to purchase this type of equipment. Let me just explain to you how advanced it is. It will outsort, if it detects that the envelope is too thick for what would be 1 ballot. It will detect if a voter did not sign the area of the envelope, their signature. It will outsort all of those. It will have it ready for staff to do the signature recognition, of which then after you do the signature recognition, you can put it through the system again, and it will outsort those that are challenged and maintain the ones that are good. And so through the technology, it will be able to increase our productivity by multiple fold versus what we had to do with our 150,000 vote by mail ballots. There's also a very unique feature. We won't be able to do it during the recall election, but I think for the primary we could, which is signing the vote by mail envelope has always been a concern for the public, in terms of their signature will show on the outside of the envelope. So in seeing what Monterey has done, they have it so they have a more extended flap that then the voter signs under the flap in the area they're supposed to, and then they, seal the envelope. By doing so, it covers the signature area that they sign, so it won't show up when it's being delivered to us. And then with the system, what the system will do is it has what they call a tab removal system, and what it will do, it uses lasers, will cut out the area that you identified where the signature is, and then vacuum it out. So, and it does that as the first pass before it even scans the signature, scans the envelope image. So these are all, like I said, this is multiple generations ahead from where we left off with our signature, with our vote by mail processing procedures. And so that's why I really see it as a great move forward for the county, with or without me.
Well, it's amazing how much innovative technology has come into this, what was a very manual process when we first started doing vote by mail ballots, or when they were called absentees. So a couple of questions about fiscal questions. Number one is, what is the fiscal impact of a vote by mail versus in-person voting?
Oh, I guess the way to characterize this is all vote by mail election versus a polling place election. And if you identify it in that way, you still have the law of providing the permanent vote by mail voters, their ballots in the mail. So then you're, as we like to say, Julie, we're conducting two elections at one time, right? We're conducting the vote by mail and having to process all those large volume of vote by mail ballots that are coming in, and at the same time having to, get the 75 locations, prepare all of the materials that are going to go out there, prepare the training materials, conduct the training for all of those poll workers to go out there. So that's a very, very expensive election. And if we didn't have to have nearly as many polling places as we would have typically, then that would reduce the footprint. And especially if it's all vote by mail, for example, then we're not having to deal with the in-person. And I would venture to think that it would probably reduce the budget by a third. I'm just guessing there without doing, all of the calculations, but I would just guess a third, just because of the labor involved preparing for in-person voting. It's probably broken down by that much.
Right. And as we've talked about before, if you set up a polling place with the poll workers and 10,000 people go there, then the cost per person is much less. But now, if only 500 go there, it's a lot more per voter that comes to the voters, to the
Exactly.
voting center. And then a couple of questions came in about, what is the cost difference between the Voters' Choice Act and a traditional polling place election? And I think you've alluded to that it is more expensive to conduct the Voters' Choice Act election with the voter service centers.
Yes, definitely. We were estimating anywhere from $450,000 to $500,000 more. So it was substantially more than what we would typically budget. I think we probably budgeted 1.2 million for the election in a typical polling place election. So it is substantially more. And the main reasons why are a couple of reasons. One is it doesn't have anything to do with a vote by mail, sending everyone a vote by mail ballot, for example. It has more to do with all the technology that went into each location. It's as if we set up our elections office at every location, yet we had to have all the communication to and from our office, for example, to be established. And so that was all being done by our IT department. So we realized that we were going to need to have a lot of support when it comes to technology and communications and connectivity. And that would be an ongoing cost that we would need to have, because you're constantly having to support it during those additional days of election. It's not just one-time cost, but ongoing costs to be sure that everything's up and running. And then the second piece is, we were no longer going to be able to pay just a poll worker stipend for one day of voting, but rather for multiple days of voting, and that we'd be paying them an hourly rate, which would start at least at minimum wage. So that would also have substantially raised the cost of the election in that manner. But at the end of the day, it would have been again, I would have fallen back to what would have been the best thing for voters. And that was why I didn't even have that settled in my mind right now at that point in time, because of understanding the challenges that we have just unique to San Luis Obispo County, being, as large a county as we are geographically. That was a question I had. And that was where the vote my bill ideas were going to be established, because it would be, I could help those, be one day of voting at one of these locations on different days. And then they would also, that those vote my bills would be able to be backup to locations in case there was a power outage. These things would be self-contained with a generator, attached with a generator, and could be self-contained. And so they could go to a location if power was out, or for instance, if there was an evacuation for some reason, if there were fires and things like that, we could set up temporarily to be able to assist voters with. So that's how we would have been able to move in that direction. But ultimately, that's where I would have landed, was would have been what would have been best for voters in terms of providing them the highest level of service that we could.
Right. And then another fiscal question, where does the grant money come from to cover the cost of the larger drop boxes?
Yes, they're coming from our I'm trying to think of the COVID-19 funding that came from the federal government. That's where the funding came from, the CARES Act funding from the federal government. That was established during the summer to assist voters in that manner. So we're still sitting on quite a substantial amount of that money, so we can move forward to be able to make those improvements that we want to assist the voters.
Great. A couple of questions about security. Did any documented security issues exist with the 2020 VBM ballot drop boxes?
No. I know we had we did have overloaded vote by mail boxes for sure. As soon as we learned that, I sent the ballots out early, and lo and behold, they were started to come back the very next day. And that weekend, they started to drop them off, right? And that was the weekend even before I had my deadline to actually send the ballots. So we got the ballots out early, the voters were voting early. And so then we did get, calls that, hey, this box is already full. And so we had to increase the number of times that we were out to retrieve ballots. Paso Robles was, really popular, for example. And so we had to be very cognizant of what was happening there. And so we increased our number of visits to be able to service those boxes. With the new ones that we have that we're going to be ordering, they are definitely designed for for a vote by mail ballot instead of the book drops that we had. And that was a matter of convenience, during the November election. I couldn't have imagined attempting to bite that off also at the same time as everything else that we had to do for the November election.
Great. So this one came from somebody who worked for several days in a voter service center. And the person says, every afternoon, the same woman came into the center. Each day she had a large duffel bag full of hundreds of ballots to turn in. Will this be allowed to happen going forward?
Yes, so that's informing me that is probably one of the drop boxes that were being emptied and then were being delivered to a voting location, knowing that those ballots were going to come to us. And that is the simplest way of doing it in terms of knowing that those were going to be coming that day. But I think we may separate those operations altogether, especially, it's only one day of voting at a polling place. So we may have teams that go out and be specifically responsible for emptying those drop boxes, at 8 p.m. on election night, and then coming directly to a drop-off location. So now we're going to be back to having our drop-off locations for polling places to drop off their ballots and their other pertinent election materials, and that's probably where these drop-box managers will be directed to at least drop off their ballots there.
Right, but isn't it also allowed, for instance, if a campaign or a party wants to collect vote by mail ballots, that it is allowed for them to collect those and then turn those in?
Oh, yes, that is true. That is true. Yes. So yes, also known as ballot harvesting. That is allowed and that is on the books. And that is something that, one of the political parties did at their headquarters, and then they did deliver almost daily to our department in Atascadero, which was a voter service center. So yes, that was allowed for them to do.
Okay, thanks. And then one other question way down here at the bottom. Is there any evidence of election fraud from this past election?
No, there is not. We haven't, anything that's large scale and things like that. No, nothing. We are going through, and this is the magic of elections now, and it shows how elections has progressed. Even as I was doing the canvas, it came to my realization with the advent of the statewide voter registration database, which was called into effect after the 2000 election, and President Bush had signed this as the Help America Vote Act, came to realize that that has hooked up all of the 58 counties in California, so that then you can see if they had previously been registered in another county, if they were issued a vote by mail ballot, if they were going to be on a roster at a polling place, for example, and then that they had registered to vote in San Luis Obispo County, for example. We would be able to tell much more readily now if someone had voted in another county and then subsequently voted in our county, and be able to track that and be able to report that out. And I will say we are actually following up on a few of those examples, for example, a few of those examples. But in terms of voter fraud, meaning large scale, organized efforts and things like that, nothing could be found in the county.
Okay. So another question that came in about voter turnout is that the voter participation has steadily increased and our 2020 numbers broke the previous records. Do you expect this trend to continue for 2022 and into the future?
Yeah, that's the magic. That's the $1 million
Get out your
question.
crystal ball.
Yes, I mean, San Luis Obispo has always had a strong turnout, and usually, like I showed in the screen before, in the top 12 is where we had ended up previously. It goes to be seen, now if we have the increased voter education and outreach and continually, advocate to the public of, the importance of voting. And if we are able to continue transparency and give voters more and more confidence in voting, I think that's a concern, is with some of the misinformation out there, that it may discourage voters from voting, thinking that their vote isn't going to count. And that's a real concern for me as an election official, is that you don't want to see someone being discouraged to vote, to participate, because they don't think their vote's going to matter and all. So I think with more voter education and outreach and more transparency to let them understand that we could, could we continue staying in fourth place? We'll have to see. But I tell you, I was trying to find some metric to, show how we might have been improved, and that was the one that was really telling. So
yeah, that was pretty amazing to make that jump. You're right. We've always had a high turnout, but to come in fourth in the, especially with a lot of smaller counties that traditionally have high turnout too. So one question, how up to date is the static voter roll on election day?
It isn't, truth be told. Okay, that's one of the downsides to the polling place election. So what happens when we print the roster? It is the voter rolls at the end of the close of registration, which is 15 days before the election. So, at the 15-day close, we do everything we can to get all the voters on the rolls who were eligible to, meaning that they could have registered as late as 11 online, as late as 11:59 on that last day, or they could have filled out a voter registration form, and as long as it was postmarked, then they're eligible to vote. And so we wait for those cards to come in so we can get them onto the voter list. And it's usually about 3 days after the close that we start printing the rosters, because I have to have them in order to give In order for them to be into the supplies for the inspectors to pick up that week preceding the election, they pick up their rosters and their ballots and whatever pertinent supplies that they need to take. Then everything else is delivered like voting booths or delivered at the voting location. So it's only as recent as that. It certainly wouldn't have anyone who's registered after that date, for example. So that's where the call center helps to be able to track down, for instance, their vote by mail ballot, since most of them are going to be, especially during the recall, they're all going to be issued a vote by mail ballot. So when you think about it, anyone that's on the rolls is going to be shown as having been issued a ballot. So even more need of having the call center to prevent that provisional voting from happening and allowing them to vote a regular ballot. So that's how that works hand in hand. That's why there is a need for having that call center now to look up the status of their vote by mail ballot.
Yeah, I can see that in the recall election. It's going to be really critical to have that. Just a quick question that you can answer very quickly. When is the clerk recorder's budget hearing?
It
They
will
start
be.
next Monday, right?
It will start next Monday, yes. And the first day is always usually the day that they cover the clerk recorder's budget.
Okay, so people, if they're interested, can watch the budget hearings on the Board of Supervisors
Yeah, I
website.
should say that I don't think, because of the outcome of May 4th, that I don't think the budget augmentation request will even be a consideration during budget hearings then. So with the needs for additional funds for additional voter education and outreach, will have to come at a later date, making those requests for them to support. But I did get their approval for the vote by mail processing equipment and the vote by mail drop boxes during that meeting. I was, trying to track everything that was being said at the very end of that meeting, and it was like, okay, wait, can I at least have, the ability to do this? And so Supervisor Prashong did agree to do that, and then the board had agreed, supported that.
That's great. Yeah, that was good news. And then briefly, one more question, and then we're going to get into the filling the position and you're leaving. How many counties adopted the Voters' Choice Act in 2020, and do you expect more to adopt this model going into 2022 or in the future?
Yeah, so if I get my numbers right, in March, I think we had 15 counties that did do the Voters' Choice Act. And during the November election, I think we had 22 to 24 counties, who that also included the vote center counties, but the additional counties, there were, I think, 24 counties or so that did what we call vote center like, and that's what we did. And so not every county did it, but more counties jumped in because they thought that was a way, to be able to handle the coronavirus pandemic. So it wasn't every county by far, but I don't think it was half the counties either. I think
Right.
it was 20 to 24 counties at the end of the day.
And then do you know how many are going to continue going forward with that?
That's a really good question. I have not, um, I don't know it doesn't seem overwhelming that many of those who did the vote center like are necessarily going to continue with that operation. I probably will guess maybe half of those will do so. So we might be at just under 20 maybe, or somewhere under 20 that will do it going forward.
Yeah, it's as you pointed out, there are some advantages and disadvantages of the system. And one of the things that we had talked about was we use two high school gyms and South County Regional Center, and those won't be available when schools aren't closed or when facilities aren't rented over the weekend. So it does present challenges. Um, I want to give a shout out before I ask you these last questions about redistricting. A question came up about redistricting, and I really want people to be aware that there is a very compressed timeline, but that the league is tracking the efforts of all of the jurisdictions, and including the county, the cities, school districts, special districts. And so people can find out information about what's going on in a particular district by visiting our website, and looking for the redistricting page. So that's just a shout out to anybody that's interested in that very exciting topic, although not exciting, but very important topic, coming up. And then the other questions, that people had were not only, shout outs to you and your staff and the good work that you've done. One person asks, why are you leaving? And I don't know if you want to address that. I know you've addressed it some in the media. And then what happens next with your successor? Do they have to have an election? Can the board appoint? If what is the direction that you're hearing that that might be moving?
Yeah, I don't mind sharing the reasons why. Certainly, as I addressed in my press release, is that I have really, especially more recently, experienced this void of not being close to my family, and that's one of the things. Moving here, um, 16 years ago, that was one of the things that I realized is moving so far from family. And, we have a pretty tight knit family and all. In fact, I remember that when you offered me the job, Julie, that my mom asked my wife, "Why does he want to move so far away?"
We're in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. And my wife told her, but he loves elections. He loves the work. And so that was one of the things. And then, our family was growing up. Our boys were really young at the time. And so that gave me an opportunity to, find a nice school district that they can go to and all. And so I was really focused on the family, on our young family. But now that all these years have passed by, my folks are 16 years older now, and it really hit home recently, in the last year and a half. I hadn't seen them for a year and a half, and the coronavirus, prevented you from traveling and seeing anyone, and it really hit home to me how far away I am from my family. And so, and then along with that is, there's just been a many, many retirements of registrars of voters throughout the state for one reason or another. Sometimes they want to leave on a high note and call it a career. And I know others are moving on to onto other jobs, other job opportunities, not necessarily in elections. And so there was an opportunity to see, where might I be able to, apply that can get me closer to home. And so Contra Costa was one, and they're, quite a sizable county. There's 700,000 registered voters there. So, 3.5 times the number of voters that we have here. 1.1 million residents there, and just really kind of part of the extended Bay Area. And it made me feel that I've honed my craft here, and that gives me an opportunity to provide services to even greater number of voters and having even a bigger impact on the work that I do and being closer to home. So that was really the driving factor for me more than anything. Was that it was really an opportunity, as I say, an opportunity of lifetime to be able to get closer to home and be able to still continue, this work that I have a lot of passion for.
Great. And
In terms of
then, yeah, replacement.
transition, so I have actually not had much conversation with the county yet, but I do believe that there is, one option is that the county could decide to appoint an individual to fulfill the remainder of the term. For example, some of the things I've been thinking about, I've been reflecting on this department, on this position, is that, there are no requirements other than being a registered voter to be qualified to run as clerk recorder. And I think the position now, especially in elections, requires a much higher level of professionalism, meaning education and experience would certainly play into becoming the department head and the leader for a position like this. And I think it's something to be considered in terms of what other avenues there might be for this position, especially when it comes to the elections side of things. And so those are things that I think the county will entertain and think about and decide on alternatives and what steps that they might want to take going forward.
And do you have, somebody asked, you have a successor in mind in your department? What kind of a structure are you leaving that can
Yes.
help the department move forward?
Yeah, so one of the things more recently was I was able to have, before we had the assistant county clerk recorder, and realizing that position just had too much on their plate, that I was able to convince the county to create 2 deputy director positions. So now I have a deputy director for clerk recorder and a deputy director for elections, of which both deputy directors were very much involved with the November election, nevertheless.
As
and
always happens.
as always happens, and with all hands being on deck. And so we certainly have the infrastructure in place. They are 2 very well qualified leaders in the department. I have the fullest confidence in both of them of moving the department forward and doing whatever whatever steps that the county deems going forward. I certainly have confidence in them being able to continue the good work of the department.
Okay, that's appreciated. Well, I appreciate there's one other question, and I'm going to address this. Is that the question was, since you're leaving, will this give the conservative majority of the Board of Supervisors an opportunity to appoint someone who believes in the conspiracy theory of fraudulent elections? And I just want to point out that the league has issued a statement, and I know that you got sent our letter to the editor, that is vitally important that the board understand that this department needs to be conducted in a professional, nonpartisan manner, certainly as it relates to elections, but with everything that you do in the department, and that our League of Women Voters will be following this very closely, and may even be reaching out to our members to say, hey, this is coming up on the board's agenda, and you all need to make your voices heard about what's important to you when they're looking at filling or taking a step to fill this very vital office, public service office in our county.
Yes, that's a great
So
suggestion.
yeah, so I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add. I think that that's the end. Hopefully I got to most of the questions, if not all of the questions. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm sure your days are going to be very busy between now and July 2nd. A lot of things to do. I know what it was like cleaning out my office after being there for 20 years. So I'm sure that you've got a bit of work to do on that. And again, we want to thank you very much, as did many of the people commenting. Thank you very much for your service. And thank you again for joining us today for this really important opportunity to get information out to our voters.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, having the opportunity to present, and also the partnership with the League of Women Voters here locally. I really appreciate that, and I, you know, look forward to that partnership continuing even without me. It's been really a valuable relationship, and being able to provide more information to voters, and especially in these lunches that you're having, Julie, has been really advantageous, and so. I heartily endorse those actions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Tommy. We appreciate your time today. That's the end of our questions. Glenn, I think you're going to put up a final slide to inform everybody. There you go. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. Thank you for submitting your very good questions and keeping me on my toes as I tried to get them all out to Tommy.